think you know the beauty of Africa in its safaris and wilderness. But do you see a continent marching on the road of new industrialization? You're familiar with the notion of a rapid-growing Chinese economy, but are you aware of the Asian giant's aspirations to become a technological innovator? Both Africa and China find themselves at a critical moment of transformation. Is more substantial cooperation needed for better development? And how can the two join hands to overcome obstacles on their respective paths? Dialogue on CGTN travels to South Africa to seek the answers. We offer you a feast of ideas and wisdom with Che Smith, a senior South African diplomat dealing with Chinese affairs, Professor Kenneth Ozoemena, a Nigerian scientist working on energy development, Iju Wang, once the youngest member of parliament in South Africa, and Dr. Paul Zilungisela Tembe, a China-Africa Studies professor who speaks excellent Mandarin. Come and join this Dialogue with the World special in collaboration with the South African Broadcasting Corporation in Cape Town, South Africa.
Hello and welcome to Cape Town in South Africa, and it's from here that we are going to bring you a special broadcast between the South African Broadcasting Corporation and the China Global Television Network, CGTN. I'm Peter Ndora, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to be one of your hosts on the program today. And what we'll be doing is taking a look at some of the important issues of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. Now, the summit that was held in Johannesburg in 2015 under the theme China-Africa Progressing Together, Win-Win Cooperation for Common Development was all about consolidating the solidarity and cooperation amongst the peoples of China and Africa. In many ways, the Beijing summit of 2018 continues with that journey, but only it happens under the auspices of the fourth industrial revolution, and that's laden with innovations and new technologies. But what does all of this mean, this new industrialization mean for Africa and China? We're going to be exploring that on the program, but I'm not alone. I'm joined by the regular host of the Dialogue on CGTN.
Hi, Peter.
Wanre, welcome to South Africa.
Feels so good, yeah.
Now, I know you've got some great scenes in China. I've seen some of them as well, but tell me what you think about Cape Town and this majestic Table Mountain.
Look, Peter, all options are on the table. But the Table Mountain does serve as a beautiful backdrop against which we are here to host a very meaningful dialogue on the future that we share with Africans, right? So we are also blessed by the severity of the winter here in South Africa and your warm friendship as well. Hi, welcome to Dialogue with Africa. I'm Yang Rui, hosting this special program in Cape Town in partnership with Peter Ndoro and
South Africa's SABC.
China and Africa see each other as a huge opportunities in seeking co-prosperity through the Belt and Road Initiative. But will the current trade war with the United States impact Africa? How do Africans see trade protectionism and digital globalization, Peter?
Well, you know what? Let's sit down, introduce our guests, and try and figure this out. And so let's start with your side. Who have you got next to you?
I'm honored to be joined on this side by Professor Kenneth Ozoemena with Wits University in Johannesburg. And next to him is a young member of the South African Parliament. He is also a member of ANC. Welcome to our special program, Dialogue with Africa.
Thank you. All right, and helping us with this discussion, I'm going to introduce right next to me Professor Paul Tembe, who's an associate professor at the Institute of African Studies, Beijng Normal University. Thanks very much for joining us. You're also a research fellow at the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute. Thanks for joining us. Next to you, Che Smith, a Senior International Trade Manager, Asia, and the development agency Westgrow, Trade, Investment and Tourism, big on your agenda. Let me start with you, Paul, and I'm just wondering, because a lot of our audiences in South Africa in particular, I know, have never heard of FOCAC, and it's another one of those summits that these peoples of Africa and peoples of China come together. Why is this one important? What value does it add in your view?
Let me start by FOCAC. FOCAC is a coherent arm that is to synergize and synthesize all bilateral relations of African countries vis-à-vis China as the power of today. What FOCAC helps us with, it helps us to streamline all the legs of bilateral relations and cooperation between Africa and China. And it started with the mineral resources, it went to industrialization, agricultural modernization, in which the two are going to be the theme of this year's FOCAC. But added into that, it will be digitization. As you've mentioned, the fourth industrial revolution. We cannot have the fourth industrial revolution without digitization. And African growth is going to see us having a huge leap into urbanization. And that also calls for technology and digitization. And now FOCAC is about to synthesize this platform and showing us the way, from where do we move forward from this moment in time.
Our friends on this side have drawn a rosy picture about the FOCAC. But do you think we are also facing multiple challenges in our collaboration with Africans and indeed the African Union when we shape our own course of development?
We have it's good that we already have the FOCAC. There isn't much problem at the moment. As the first speaker already mentioned, there is a need for us now to move to real industrial revolution. We're already in it. We cannot run away from that now. That's where we are, but there is a need for us now to bring Africa at par with what the industrial revolution is going to bring about. And I hope that as we continue with this discussion, we're going to expound on the challenges and the opportunities we should be looking at.
First and foremost, I'm afraid we have the image problem about China. Well, you are a rainbow country. China is often portrayed as a panda or a dragon. Now, what kind of image does China go down history?
I think if I may add this thing, FOCAC is not only a platform. I mean, also China's image of growing presence in Africa and globally is more than just one single action. It's the FOCAC and various Chinese involvements globally. It's a commitment from China in globalization, global village, and human race as a unity, which is very different from what the US is busy doing now. I mean, traditionally, Africa has been mostly sidelined by Western interests, particularly if you look at where what US is doing now, is creating trade wars and creating unilateralism. That's not something what we look for. If you look at FOCAC, its mission, its mandate, its purpose, it's definitely a more unified approach to raise the interest of general public and for the better life of all citizens.
A few years ago, the BBC delivered a documentary called "China is Back." Is China a threat or a friend?
Certainly as a friend. It's a collaborative friend. It's a friend that really aims to seek a win-win solution. Win-win was never a verb that I grew up with or knew about. And it's really imparted something on us to say, what does China mean by win-win? And what do we understand by win-win? I don't think threat is something we want to say is what China offers us. We're certainly not seeing that. We're seeing collaboration and we're seeing mutual beneficiation for the two, for the country and for the continent. I think what's critical is the threat being perceived from an economic, development, environmental, and these are the things I'm hoping FOCAC is going to look at. What is it that this time, as we go into this new world, when there is trade wars going on, how are we as Africa and China going to balance and realign this international trade system for the benefit of both our people?
And I just wonder, because there's a perception with many Africans that China actually might be a Trojan horse, a colonialist power that's coming, steal our minerals and give us a few gifts in the process. What's your experience of that relationship? And I suppose couch it in a way that we can understand on the continent what China is trying to do.
What I've learned from the West is like you have to mimic a ready-made system. You can only achieve modernity if you follow how the West is. But what I've discovered with almost 2 decades of dealing with China, starting in China and coming back to Africa, I want to take the statement win-win situation a level higher. I've experienced a multi-civilizational dialogue which has been brought by China. That is a big word because it means China is cognizant that Africa has got its own civilization as well. So it allows these 2 civilizations to have some sort of synergy in order to move forward. That's why the theme of the BRICS, the Forum for Human Rights that has passed and there's one coming next month, the main thing has been prosperity for mankind. And that is the approach that China is bringing up. Now, if you take another initiative like One Belt Initiative, One Belt Initiative also, it is a unifying initiative. It's not China sitting at the helm and telling everybody what to do. Everybody contributes to the melting pot of humanity. And now, if we go to the trade war, that as my colleague mentioned.
Can I humbly take over your point on the trade war?
Yes.
In fact, the United States, particularly its media, sees the current trade war as a battle for primacy of digital technology. China, on the other hand, says, well, the Belt and Road Initiative aims to build interconnectivity through digital technology. Our friends in South Africa also say, look, Yang Rui, digital technology may help us develop through frog leaps. To have a corner overtaking. Do you think this is an easy job?
No, you know, the trade war is it is a war, and when war, nobody wins in any war. That's the first thing. It's going to hurt US, it's going to hurt China, but the people that will be hurt more will be the emerging markets, mainly Africa and other emerging markets. So. I think it is important to, it's very critical to stop this war going on. At the moment, last week I was happy to learn that there is a dialogue now going on between US and China negotiators that says, well, maybe Donald Trump and the GP will meet sometime this year around November, and you see what has happened to the market, and the market never likes uncertainty. When there is certainty, and then market grows, but when there is none, everything changes. So,
look, gentlemen, everybody in China is talking about the benefits of Tencent, Alibaba, and Baidu, which is the Chinese equivalent of Google, the search engine. However, as a scientist, and every fellow guest speaker here, would you voice your concerns about the alleged double-edged sword of digital technology? Will it violate our privacy, or instead it will promote the transparency? Do you think the younger generation in South Africa, Chris, will seize this opportunity and grow up very quickly in closing the gap between China and Africa economically?
The US has been advanced in terms of technology. China is following suit. And the fact that Chinese technology and digital advances, it's getting a fast pace, which is beneficial to us because we get the best at affordable price. Because we understand if we particularly go into rural areas, the government in Africa has been doing a lot to bring the digital divide, and that's what we need. We've got an infrastructure deficit in Africa, and that's what we need to bring up the space.
With the talk of the 4th industrial revolution and the question of cyber development and privacy, I think if we should look at the benefits of technology, what technology can bring us. Now, within the broader scheme of words, what technology is teaching us, it teaches us that we can go down and unlock old systems and get rid of this redundant, all the type of education, redundant, old type of production, centralized conveyor belt, second industrial revolution type of production. We see a situation whereby our youngsters can leapfrog in their development and education, whereby we've got Baidu, we've got YouTube. Knowledge is there at the tip of your fingers. So what we need to do is to fast track the putting of cable, to fast track the accessibility of the ICT facilities.
I'm afraid one of the problems that get featured prominently in the local media is unemployment rate, which is put at perhaps 40% in South Africa. Do you think digital technology will help solve the problem of joblessness, or do you think you'd rather tend to labor-intensive, low-value-added manufacturing that China shifts from our continent to Africa as the groundwork for reindustrialization or economic takeoff?
Right, I think you've really hit the key element here. How do we balance industrialization and the industrial revolution of 4.0? And how do we leapfrog? We all talk about leapfrogging, but how do we do this? So on one end, we need to industrialize, and I think this is where it's critical. The Forum on China-Africa Coorperation has funds available for our industrialization. So they are supporting us to industrialize. The main reason behind that is for two reasons. We need to create jobs, we need to grow our economy. And the African economy is growing. So I don't think China is investing in Africa thinking I'm just putting money into a pot. They really see the development. But we're also looking at the technological evolution. Jack Ma was here a couple of weeks ago, and it was fascinating for him to see us as someone who didn't know about Africa. I mean, Jack Ma, Alibaba, international, he admitted to say, I need to come and understand more about what's going on in Africa. And I think this is the core about Forum on China-Africa. It is how do we manage to understand each other. The ideas of threats, the ideas of Trojan horses, these are all, it's misinformation or media that has its own agenda, but this opportunity that we have to engage is critical, because once the Chinese come, they love South Africa, they love Africa. What we've done in the Western Cape is we've positioned ourselves to start to look at industrialization and the advancement of technology in terms of digitalization. So we're hitting this on a two-pronged approach. And I think the difficulty is for the Chinese, where do we really go? Do we go industrializing, or do I invest in the digitalizing?
And you've raised an interesting point, and a concern for me is that you have China, one country, Africa, 54 states.
Yes.
And so the question is, how do we do this cooperation? We're at different rates of progress on the continent. When we talk about digitization, some of our countries are struggling just to get electricity. How do we do this cooperation? Does China have to have 54 different relationships?
That's a good question, you know, and the African continent.
This is the role of the African Union that we should perform the job, that should provide the Africans with the opportunities through inter-regional coordination.
We have that ability to understand that. We want a consensus-driven approach. And you're very correct, the development is very different. So we have a 2063 agenda. We all know where we want to be. We've agreed on the principles of how we want to do that. It is now critical for the African Union and the regional bodies in their negotiations with China to make sure development is equal on the continent. And that is going to be critical. Are we going to be interest-based as countries when we engage with China, or are we going to be as a continent based on how do we advance as a continent with China? And I think that's going to be critical for us. The concerns we would certainly have is if China starts to develop some areas faster than other areas for her own economic interests. What I mean by that is we are a market. We're almost 1 billion in our market. So we have a consumer growth, middle-aged income starting to increase.
But Chair, I think you forgot that just because China is a third party in this FOCAC war, one of the hosts, it's also a conducive, actually a very good idea for China to come in as sort of as a mediator to work amongst our African unions, because our African brothers and all have their own different interests in geographically different as well. But China as a third party actually is best suited to liaise and unite this particular, have a joint mentor, a joint purpose going forward.
I want to say something about what my colleague here said around the fourth industrial revolution, about the job and the threats. Remember that whenever there is a revolution, there is bound to be disruption. It has happened from time to time. Every revolution will bring a disruption, and those disruptions are bound to create even more jobs. Think about what happened to even the Uber we are having today. How people are now creating their own jobs. People are having mini businesses. So we shouldn't see the fourth industrial revolution as something that is going to cause job losses and that. We should also look at it. It's going to create jobs that are highly skilled, more paying jobs, more decent jobs. And I think that is where we should be looking at the fourth industrial revolution. It is here, and we're not going to run away from that. We see what cell phone has done to the world, to Africa as an example. Remember when we used to have our landlines, and check what cell phone has done. Now we can do business in a very different way. Even local people who have no access to, who never had access to anything, can now have access to doing business, electricity. We're in South Africa, for example, because we may not see the problem of electricity in South Africa. But when you go to other parts of Africa, you understand what you are talking about, electricity. People are now using cell phone to conduct businesses, powerful businesses around, creating jobs. And I think that's a issue. Is exciting, and we have to encourage our youth to that level.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to bring in Chris, because what I like about Chris is, and we've described him as an African Chinese or Chinese African, and maybe there's something there about understanding our cultures and the differences between the two, because in Africa, and maybe I'm stereotyping a little bit, but where I've traveled, one of the journeys that we have to have is, you said that China, we're not arrogant, we're here to help. But there is a perception by many Africans that, hang on, we actually have to operate by China's rules. This relationship actually is almost prepared for us by China. And also that China comes in with cheap goods, and that compromises our own growth, our own industries. How do we manage the cultures? Because I'm hearing one race say one thing, but maybe perceptually out there, people are feeling something different. Let me start with you, Chris.
Yeah, Peter, I think because my background, of being South African and being of Chinese descent, Chinese origin, if you look at China's history with Africa, go back to Ming Dynasty. When I was in Parliament, I think in 2005 and 6, we had a large display of a map of Africa, drawn up by back then by the Chinese voyager. You'll see in the last couple of 100 years, China's interest in Africa is more in trade, which is more about mutually beneficial activities.
And we send medical team to help our brothers and sisters.
There was no
here.
colonial activities, nothing sort of that. In the recent years, because China has been a manufacturing powerhouse, similar with what Japan did a couple of years ago. Japan was sending cheap goods to US. China started just shipping cheap goods in Africa because of the demand. But now you can see this is a natural progress of a country, of industrialization. Now China has now up from cheap goods to much better or advanced technology, a better product, and which is what we are benefiting right now.
It's what we call the process of a low carbon development.
It's a process.
We bring GDP pursuit.
So I wouldn't say the stereotyping was there. I recall when I grew up in Cape Town in school, if there was stationery was broken and my teacher would say, those was made in China. Everyone was laughing. But that was true. There were definitely some cheap product that was not up to good quality. But now you see, as we progress, as the two countries work together, particularly with CSR, it was DTI, it was various departments in South Africa and also with other African countries, you can see a lot of manufacturing capacity and skill transfer are happening in Africa, and that's what we need in
this
Africa.
is all happening at a high level, actually, but the ordinary man in the street.
Let us let us not confuse business with politics.
Okay.
The ordinary man in the street knows that China likes Africa and that Africa has got very good relationships with China. We've passed that. We've passed that romance. We've passed the courtship stage.
Yeah.
Now, this is business, and business says, first, Africa must have intertrade. We cannot expect China to be the helm of developing Africa. Africa must open its borders first. That's number one. Africa must up its intertrade. That's number one. Number two, accept that we are not equally endowed, whether it be human resources or natural resources. So even the rollout of the fourth industrial revolution is going to be at different stages for different countries. Thirdly, China itself has accepted this. That is why China has chosen some countries as pilot countries for China. Not because China favors this country, it's because China is aware of different specifics. There are benefits in dealing with Ethiopia because of Ethiopia's specificities. There are benefits in dealing with South Africa and other countries of this thing. So business is business. When it's feasible to do business, let's do business and focus on that. Now, what we are saying is that how can we speed up this cooperation of FOCAC and create strong pillars that will sustain Africa-China relations. Not for Africa-China relations in isolation, remember, for the greater part of humanity. That's what China is here for.
Well, I would rather raise a follow-up question about democracy. In the wake of the Cold War, most African countries have been transformed into democracy, which is supposed to be very helpful in engineering economic success. But what we saw in some of the countries, I would rather not mention those names, was actually disaster, economic chaos. Governance is the critical and key, if not catchphrase in our vocabulary, about the success of the economy.
There are so many inspirations we can draw from, from the past and to the present. Nothing is static. We look at, for example, the issue of infrastructure. Infrastructure is the most important problem in Africa. Whether we're talking about fourth industrial revolution or how the business will run, how to leapfrog anything. If we don't have infrastructure, nothing is going to happen. And I think that is what my colleague already had mentioned, the other countries. I know in Nigeria, for example, they have the Lekki Free Trade Zone, and it was a pilot scheme, and I think it is, they can learn from the mistakes of that pilot scheme. And of course, those mistakes or challenges are out there. You can read them in the literature. They talk about planning, inadequate planning. The most important one happens to be the infrastructure. They never knew about this. They never knew about access to road. There is poor transport issue. They never knew about electricity generation. How can you work? How can you deal with any of these businesses we are talking about without electricity or good road network?
The advantages that have been institutionalized in China, for example, could be ruled by decree. When you look at the issue of infrastructure building, you have to have easy solution to the use of land. But in your country, I'm afraid you have different lobby groups, interest groups, political forces in the parliament who argue for the protection of farmers' interests. I'm not saying the Communist Party of China does not aim to protect the interests of the Chinese farmers. In your country, it's days and months and years of discussion and consultation. It takes time, right? So in this particular area, I see a big sea difference between rule by decree and democratic consultation, parliamentary debates for days and months. So what do you think of the differences regarding efficiency?
I think before we even go there, what are we ultimately looking for as a humanity? Is it not an equal platform to trade? Is it not an equal platform to develop? Whether we have a democracy, whether we have a communist state, whether we have a semi-communist state, I think the critical aspect is let the people decide how they want to engage in the international arena on an equal platform. This is the critical thing I want to see coming out of the Forum on China-Africa Coorperation. Let us ensure that our trade can be on an equal footing. Now, I'm very honored to see the Chinese are already reducing their import tariffs. So President Xi's commitment to opening up the economy is being witnessed within a space of 5 years. And usually this takes quite a long time. So in December we see already a lot of the input duties coming off, which means Africans can trade now at a reduced rate. Secondly, we've got the China International Import Expo that President Xi is hosting in November. This is a wonderful opportunity because you're allowing South Africa, which is going to be the guest host country, to be in a platform that can now showcase their products to the Chinese community. Then when we talk about these high-level discussions of governments, allow the people to decide how they want, whether they want a democracy or not. But once we interact with each other, we'll start to realize you do have some good aspects, and we have some good aspects. So how do we bring it all together to make an equal platform on the international arena?
It's an interesting question, and Paul, I want you to answer this as well. But I want to ask you, because I'm hearing Young Ray here talk about the differences in Chinese governance and the West. Are we kind of feeling the pressure, and I see it from time to time, where African countries have to start to decide which side they're on? Are they going west, are they going east, or can we do both?
Let me use the phrase I love using nowadays.
Let me paraphrase your question a little bit. It might be difficult for major political forces in your parliament to build consensus, given the seat differences between the trade union, the Communist Party, and ANC. But in China, President Xi Jinping's voice is respected the country over. In your country, it's a very different case.
Let me just put this on the table. Now I'm talking
Not
to
on the table mountain.
Yes. Now it can be as well be on the table mountain for all African presidents to see it. Maybe it's high time we spoke to the elephant in the room. Africa is reading from the old book. Africa refuses to let go the red tape of the old. Africa creates its industry and its laws based on the old book, which was meant to serve a specific time in history. And we've gone far past that time. Let me take one thing which is hailed as the paragon of South Africa. South African Bureau of Standards. South African Bureau of Standards is beautiful. We all adhere to it. But South African Bureau of Standards is drawn at the level of the first world. It means we cannot have inventions or innovations in South Africa because we are not allowed to make mistakes. So at the end, what is allowed is that what comes from outside, from the West mostly. For example, my colleague there, you mentioned that Chinese goods were referred to as Hong Kongs long ago, but nobody speaks of that today. Today we hail at Chinese quality. Why? Because China had the learning curve. They set the standards low at the beginning in order for them to create innovations. You cannot create innovation if you ignore your own local conditions. So we are reading from the old book. That's number one. Number two, there is a discrepancy in China-Africa relations simply because China has got long-term planning and Africa has got short-term planning. Now, here's my question. How long will China pour money for investments when our policies are never become legislated?
This question has made us jobless.
Yes.
We've lost our job. Very good question.
There's no long-term planning because policies are not into legislature. Let me take incentive policy, investment incentive policy. Investment incentive policy in South Africa, we make it sound big, but there's only one line in our law. about incentive policy. There is no elaborate incentive policy. There's books on the incentive policies, but in the law of South Africa, there's only one sentence, which says nothing actually.
Paul, here's the thing you're doing, and this is the question I raised earlier.
Yeah.
You're talking about South Africa, Ken can talk about Nigeria, China only needs to talk about China. How do we, and this is I guess where you're talking about the COMESAs, the African unions, because we actually have to find a common position on these issues. It can't be just South Africa needs this, Westgro needs this. How do we get the continent to behave almost in the same way as China is able to do by being one country?
Deng Xiaoping was the architect of
Yeah.
the modernization drive since 1978, 40 years ago. This year witnesses the 40th anniversary of our opening up and reform. Now, the issue, I'm afraid, is whether you guys in South Africa can create the strong feeling and impression that the latest policy move by the newly elected president would avoid a repeat of the land reform in your neighboring country of Zimbabwe, because that will cause an uproar in public debates as to the future of South Africa. Whether you follow the suit of Mr. Robert Mugabe in depriving the whites of their land, I know you guys have a lot to say about the issue of equality following the end of apartheid in 1949. But people around the world just look closely at the net marriage economic performance in Zimbabwe. That's why Mr. Robert Mugabe was ousted 3 elections. Do you have a solution that can persuade the rest of the world, look, you are very careful in not repeating the mistakes in Zimbabwe?
I think, well,
I mean, the Western media has been very critical of Zimbabwe. China keeps a neutral position about whatever their internal affairs. Let me make that very clear and clarify this situation.
I think this land issue is at everybody's heart. I mean, land security is important. But if you look at Zimbabwe situation, was different. I mean, they had a legacy issue, and after the UK stopped supporting them, obviously all hell went loose. But in South Africa particularly, it's a different scenario. The ruling party, the governing party, has ensured that the land reform is not going to turn out to be a land grab. I think that's what's important. People must. Everyone must now go into the actual clause or the actual discussion within this land debates, and not just superficially looking at the short sentence. I think that was created at the chaos, thinking that SA is going to move towards that direction. I don't think it's going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen.
And also, if you look at general development, it's about resources. I mean, Paul also mentioned China. China is one country, and Africa is 54 states. It's about getting people together. Look at the resources spent. I mean, China has great solution, but China is not the solution. I mean, with the trade war, China has definitely been dented with a lot of resources that would have otherwise been able to assist other countries in terms of globalization. And with what Shay mentioned, the first China import and export market, it shows Chinese commitment for opening up their domestic demand economy to other countries. Particularly, FOCAC should take this opportunity, because this is probably the first time in Chinese history, that a government level import-export targeted at the Chinese domestic market, allowing us to export our goods and services. And that's what Africa should be good at. We should focus on our agro business and value add, and start exporting some of our base, well, not necessarily some of our product or some of our services, going that side in exchange for our beneficial, for our other human resource capital, for our infrastructure builds here. All these things need to be planned under a budgetary constraint, which everyone suffers. I think in the global economy right now, not only China has a problem, we also have a problem. I think that's across the board.
When our friends in Africa take a closer look at the lessons and the inspirations of China's economic reform, by the way, the reform itself remains pretty controversial when we review the full decade. Now, China actually, the Communist Party of China took over power in 1949 through land reform and through an introduction of the controversial sense of egalitarianism. That's the utopian dream that our first generation of the leadership introduced. when we decided to open up China, we also did it through the land reform, through the reform in the agricultural areas. Now, land reform has become a very important catchphrase in our vocabulary in defining the alleged success of China's economic reform and our modest governmental reshuffling. So what can I hear from our African friends about the land reform in Africa, in South Africa in particular?
Land reform.
You guys seem to be tight-lipped about this.
You know, it's because we're sitting in the middle of it.
In the middle of it.
It's hard to scream when you're in the boiling pot, so to speak. Land reform, it has got to be solved, but it has to be solved in an orderly way. It has to be solved in a way that benefits the country, not in a destructive way. I spoke about policies and law. So land reform has to take the process of the law. If we become populists about issues of land reform, we are going to create chaos that is going to take us back in history.
Excuse me, is that a matter of law or politics? Is that about the elections? And the politicians raise the issue to appeal to the mind and the heart of the poverty-stricken population.
For me, I think it's a bit of both. But we have to understand that South Africa is not going to go the way of Zimbabwe. I think we have to understand that. And I don't think that is what the ruling party is doing. From what I've read and from what I've heard, land reform should be. There is a greater need for land reform. You said that of China. In Nigeria, I remember when we have, I think it's still in the law of Nigeria, where we have what they call land use decree. That land use decree was done so many years, 1979 or so. Every land belongs to the government. That is the bottom line. If the government finds something in your land, where you build your house, the government has the right to take it and compensate you. But again, South Africa has got a very different scenario because of the evils of apartheid. But I believe that land reform has to be done, but it has to be done as the law requires it to be done. Okay. It has to be done in such a way that people is not going to destroy what we have built over the years.
All right, here's my fear. We can speak and talk at quite a high level, technical issues, and I'm thinking about Kofi Mensah in Ghana, Abel Mwale in Kenya, Jabu Sithole in South Africa, Wu Yen in China, Rita Ko in China, and they're sitting watching this. They said, we've heard about FOCAC and this China-Africa Coorperation, but what they're saying to themselves is, how is my life going to be better tomorrow as a result of all of these amazing discussions you're having? And I want to know, because I'm watching this on TV now, and I'm like, this is such a great conversation, but
and if I were to ask your question, yes. I would not simply repeat your question. I would say the issue is whether we can live and let live, to introduce more cultural diversity, to deliver broad tolerance for something that might be irrelevant to your own culture, your own political institutions, that might work for our country. So is that an issue of a live and let live?
Peter, I think that the question is critical. And what we're asking ourselves is how do we plug into the high-level dialogue? So the critical thing to realize is there's an action plan. When the summit is over, there are various sectors, various categories that are identified with very clear or ways that we can move forward. What we need to do as both academics, in the political, in the legal, in the trade, is unpack those, work with stakeholders, which means it's not government-driven, it's business-driven or sector-driven, to ensure we get the benefits. It certainly worries us that people don't understand about what FOCAC is all about. And I think this is critical. We need to continue engaging, not only from a China-Africa perspective, but an Africa perspective. We meet at the African Union, let us talk openly and frankly about the citizens of Africa. Just to go back to land reform, I think the critical question I ask myself is, why does Africa look for land reform? Why did China first start with land reform? It was a route to economic emancipation. This is the critical factor we must look at.
And also emancipation of the mind.
And how does China assist Africa to emancipate economically? And I think this is something I'm looking forward to in the FOCAC. There is an agricultural fund. I think it's significant in terms of its billions, but I'd like to see a little bit more, because that is where we're looking at. We're looking at the emancipation from the land. And I think this is, for me, very critical. Then we're going to talk about it is critical. It gets people to go to the webpage, type in FOCAC, and start to read about the opportunities that exist for you. Come to your government and say, I saw Shay on TV, how can I go and get access to funding? How do I go to China and take my product to China so that the Chinese consumer understand there is quality products coming
I'm
from
glad you
Africa?
put your finger on a very interesting issue of emancipation. It's either emancipation of the mind or emancipation of people from poverty by the year 2020. That's a vision and blueprint of President Xi Jinping. But when we look at emancipation of people from poverty, it means how to use public spending. When we want to live people in their millions out of poverty in 2 years, it has a lot to do with liquidity, funds. And there are critical voices as to why the Chinese government keeps spending billions of dollars outside our country, like on the infrastructure building in developing countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. There are different voices in our country about this, although no one questions the political will of the Chinese leadership in moving ahead. So I'd like to have your opinions about how to keep a balance between domestic politics and overseas assistance and investment, because all politics are local, right? Chris?
Well, I think it's, again, it's about fighting for resources. I mean, similarly in Africa we have, just coming back to African Union, I mean, when we had, when South Africa first started getting chairing on the African Union, I think 2-3 years back, and now we've been afforded a UN Security Council seat. It's all about fighting to get there. But once we get there, we find our hands are strong. We don't have much resources here from Africa to do what we envisage to do. I think similar in China, obviously, China also got domestic problem where you're gonna fight resources. How are we gonna juggle our enough
By the end of the
budgets?
day, I mean, it's an issue of international responsibility as a major rising power on the horizon. Do you have high expectations of China in terms of its responsibility as a major and principal stakeholder?
Yes, I have high expectations about China. Let us look at Chinese development or Chinese rise as a global paradigm shift. We cannot run away from that. I don't mean that China is becoming a hegemon, a superpower, but this is a paradigm shift that places China in the center. That is the first fact. Now let me say why it's important for China to invest in places like Africa. China needs space to be a global, to move its business forward. China needs Africa, a peaceful Africa. China needs a real, a feasible Africa for business. Because if Africa is not developed, we're not going to have peace, we're not going to have stability. A place that has got no stability is no place for doing business. That's number one.
Peter, do you think China, it is politically correct to call China a new colonialist?
It's a tough one, and I think it's managing perceptions. But for as long as investment and trade seems to be going in one direction, there's always going to be that perception that one is a big brother and one's a younger brother. And perhaps this is what we need to explore, is what does Africa invest in China? What does Africa actually export to China beyond raw materials? Until that relationship changes, there's always going to be that perception that big brother is coming in with rules and formats, and that younger brother, because we're in the inferior situation, have to kind of play along and benefit from the benevolence of this great power?
Young brothers or old brothers, we are not big brothers. We attach so much importance and respect to brotherhood with Africans. When you ask what Africans have done in China, you have done so much in investing in the cultivation of friendship and mutual trust between the two continents, between the two sides. I really appreciate your insightful contributions to this meaningful dialogue here in Cape Town against the beautiful Table Mountains. Okay. We have put enough viable options on the table.
Right.
Not the Table Mountain. Thank you again for the participation in this dialogue with Africa, Peter.
Young Ray, thanks so much indeed. It's been a pleasure for me to be on the dialogue with the legendary Young Ray. It's been great, and let's continue these conversations, and not just on television, not just at the political level, but when you travel to China, when you travel from China to Africa, talk, share, because only when people on the ground really interact will this project really get off the ground. And thank you very much. What do I say? 再见.
再见. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Yes, 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 yes. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.